Welcome back to Epic Exchanges, the podcast and our YouTube version. I am super thrilled today to welcome Karen Laos. Oh, I should have asked, how do I pronounce your
I
name?
forgot to tell you, like house.
Sorry?
Laos like house.
Laos. Okay.
Yes. Sorry, that was
Karen
my
Laos.
bad.
My mistake to the podcast. And that's why we go here on YouTube with the unedited version, because you see that we all make mistakes.
I love it.
So Karen, why don't you introduce yourself to the audience?
Sure. Well, when I was 6 years old, I negotiated my first successful purchase at a flea market because basically my dad gave me a few dollars and he said, go have fun, but never pay full price. So I always had this in me of my dad of the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You have to ask, otherwise you're not going to get, which led me to a really successful career. But on the other hand, I had the other side of me, which is my mom in the household where she was a homemaker, 9 kids. She was just trying to keep it together. And as a traditional family, it was all about doing whatever my dad said. So what was modeled to me is you don't have a voice in the home. But what I took from that as a kid is that I didn't have a voice as far as me, who I was, just basically being me. And so that was a lot to navigate over the years. But I jumped to the part of being tongue-tied in a boardroom where my boss actually had to shut down the meeting. And she said to me, Karen, later, she goes, you didn't trust your gut. And I didn't agree with what I was about to present. But the challenge is that I realized, oh my gosh, it's because I was taught that you don't question your boss. So that's a little bit about my story, but from a formal bio perspective, it's all about where I started, which was in HR, and then did corporate training. That led me to a 14-year career being head of training and development for a communications company. And then I left in 2020 to focus on my mission to eradicate self-doubt in 10 million women in the next 10 years. And that has all been this amazing journey over the past 3 years around helping women to speak up with confidence and have the conversational tools to know what to say and how to say it in any situation. So my expertise is all under the umbrella of presence as well as storytelling. So it's very fitting that we are here today because stories are so important. As you know, they are a gift, and that's what you talk about as well. So that's a huge part of my story. But as far as credibility related to brands, I've worked with all kinds of brands, been lucky to be on stages like at NASA, at Google, at Facebook, Netflix, and a lot more. So that's a little bit about me.
Wow, okay. Already so much. But why don't you tell us about how you got from not trusting your voice, not speaking up or against a boss or an authority figure to where you are now?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it was such a vivid moment when I was in that boardroom because I had had so much career success. Because what I've come to realize more and more now, also with other women, but also men too, is this major self-doubt. And I felt that I had this doubt in certain situations, but I also had this incredible confidence. And here's what I've learned. When it comes to my expertise, I've always had confidence. I've always actually been overconfident related to the things that I deliver because I know that what I'm offering is of value to someone, helping them to speak with more clarity and confidence, for example. But the challenging part that I've had to work through with years of therapy, years of personal growth work, incredible opportunities in business groups, leadership groups, therapy groups, all kinds of things, is that I didn't think that I was good enough or worthy just because I existed. It was always about, well, if I have value to add, then people will like me, respect me, etc. So I hung my hat so much of most of my life on my career. Now, I always enjoyed work, so it wasn't hard for me. But that was the personal thing that I've had to navigate most of my life, is realizing. And once I had that moment of revelation of, oh my gosh, this is something that I didn't even realize that I didn't realize at the time, that it's about when you can get to the point, and here's where I feel like my wish is for everybody, when you can get to the point where you recognize that you have value just because you exist, that's where the magic happens in my mind, or the fulfillment or peace or whatever you want to call it. Because when we're so busy chasing success, whatever that looks like for you, or we're chasing people pleasing, trying to make sure everybody else is happy, we're chasing perfectionism, whatever it is, you name it. I feel like these are all these demons that get in the way of us being our true selves. And so for me, when I got to the point where I realized not just the value that I bring, but I realized the freedom that can happen when we don't let those other things plague us. Because I don't think you can ever fully get rid of self-doubt. I think there's always going to be times where it creeps in. But to me, the really important thing is that when we don't let that paralyze us to the point where we don't speak up, or we hide our true selves from the world. And I feel like what I had a lot of the times, and this actually just came up for me recently, distorted truth sometimes. So what I mean by that is, like a lot of us, it's easy to distort the truth when we want to make ourselves look a certain way, or we want somebody to be happy with us. And I would say that that's something that, especially when we're trying to please someone else, we might do something that we feel like, oh, well, this will make them feel better, or I'm just going to say this because it'll keep the peace, or whatever it is. Not like, it's not about lying per se, but it's just withholding certain things. And I found that for too long, I was withholding my true self from the world, and that wasn't serving anybody. But it was a long, long journey to get to where I am now, because I like to say that I really was in a prison of my own making. And I think that a lot of people are in a prison of their own making, but we have to recognize that we have the power of self-agency. We get to choose the way we show up. And with every choice, there's a price and a payoff, of course. But I do think it's really important to recognize that, like, I just had to recognize, wow, I have been doing this because I've been so afraid of the backlash, or whatever you want to call it, of what would happen if I said this or that, or what would they think of me, or, oh, I don't want to rock the boat. Everything in my upbringing was, you keep the peace at all costs. So that's a little bit about that.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. There is so much in there. I mean, I love that you mentioned about choice. We all have choice, agency. And I kept coming up with the people pleasing thing. And a lot of people think that people pleasing is about just doing what someone else wants. But no, it's more about keeping the peace and keeping it easy, mostly for us, more comfortable for us. Even if it's a difficult choice to make, it's not what we want ultimately. So what would you say through your experience, your personal experience, but also with working with all the people you've been working with over the last 3 years in particular, what would you say is the biggest challenge for women? And yes, men as well, but I would say a lot of women were brought up the same way, in asking for what they truly want.
Yeah, I'd say it's two things. One is a question I'm going to pose back to anybody, because I love this question that one of my first coaches asked me. What would you want if you weren't afraid to want it?
Hmm.
I think that the two things are, that one problem is we don't know what we want. Another problem is that we know what we want, but we again, we're not afraid to want it, is the part where all these other things creep in. Well, but it's not perfect. Oh, but it's going to disappoint someone, or, all those voices that tell us we can't or we shouldn't, which I think is probably even a more powerful word in a negative way, should. That's a shaming word. So it's amazing though, how many of us have these, I think just societally, there are these rules that we feel like we need to follow, that we've been culturally conditioned to follow. So I'd say that one of the biggest problems is simply not knowing and not always being in touch with what we really want or what we need, because we're so focused on what everybody else needs, we forget about ourselves. And I do think that the root of all of this is self-doubt, because the other component I was going to bring up is the fear of asking. And I'd say this is a universal truth. I mean, I was doing a talk, it was more of a workshop with an executive team whose job, it was a wonderful nonprofit. Their job was to use their connections to ask for money for this nonprofit. And I was hired to help them with how to ask. And one of the guys in the room, there were about 20 people there, he said, Karen, I feel weird even asking you to hand me the pen that's in front of you, just across the table. I don't want to inconvenience you. I don't want to bother you, put you out. He goes, it's kind of like when you're at a meal with somebody and you want the potatoes, but they're at the end of the table, but you don't want to ask, pass the potatoes. And I remember thinking, gosh, it is so fascinating how challenging all these social mores are that get in our way. And yet when you flip it, when you think about the person at the other end who has the potatoes and you ask, hey, can you pass the potatoes? The person is happy to do it. Just like I would have been happy to give him the pen that he wanted to write with that was right in front of me. So there's a vulnerability in asking that I do think is a big part of it. People don't want to put someone else out. And then the other component is that it's flat out vulnerable because of the possibility of rejection. If you even want to look at, I mean, there's so many ways we could even talk about that, because it's technically somebody isn't rejecting you personally, but it feels personal. So that's also hard. And
Yeah.
asking for things like a raise or a salary or a promotion, for example, or even asking for business. All of this stems from that same thing. It feels uncomfortable. And what if they say no? Then what will they think of me? It all kind of stems back to what are people going to think? Which is, it's so unfortunate, because people are going to think things anyway, and they're probably not even thinking whatever we think they're thinking. And they're not even thinking about us, they're thinking about themselves.
Oh, so true. And it's a really good thing to remind ourselves of. And it's so funny. I so resonated with your example of working with a non-for-profit, because for 25 years, I planned events, fundraising events for not-for-profits, working with volunteer committees and everything. And their job was to ask for sponsorships, for people to buy tickets for auction items. And it is super uncomfortable, and you have to teach that. But the worst, everybody always thinks the worst is getting the no, but the no just means that you can move on to the next person and stop wasting your
Exactly.
time.
Yes.
People don't like to give the no either. That's the other thing, right? Like,
It's true.
oh, there's so much in there, so much to unpack, but let's move on and focus here. Um, so what would you suggest is one thing that we could all work on to improve our own ability to speak up and to really ask for what we want? Because the truth is, people can't read our minds. And if we don't ask, they don't even know what we want.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have something called the confidence key, and it's a 4-step framework around making the ask. So I'll run through that briefly, and we've already basically covered the first two. Is one, you've got to face your fears and figure out what is it that's getting in the way. When we can name that and be more aware of it, then we can do something about it. And then the second is to identify what you actually want. So you're clear on what you're asking. And then the third is to prep. So it's ultimately making your case and thinking about it from the audience's perspective. So let's say I was asking you for a promotion. I want to be thinking, what does Kelly care about? What matters to her? How can me asking for a promotion actually serve her? So coming up with benefits to you and really getting clear on that for you, so that when I position it, you almost think it's a favor to you. And then the fourth is making an actual direct ask. So I want to give an example of this because a lot of times we think that we're asking directly, but we're not.
Mhm.
And I think about this, and I'm sure you'll be very familiar with this too, related to your background. But I remember a story here with all of the salespeople that I've trained over the years, and there was one exercise that was particularly striking. I would get them into pairs and they had to practice their pitch with each other, and they had 1 minute just to what are the skeletal elements of the pitch, and the one main rule was that they had to make the ask at the end. So it would be very much like, hey Kelly, would you like to learn more, or would you like to buy my product? And I recorded these conversations. Before we would watch the recording back, I would ask, how many of you raise your hand if you felt like you made a direct ask? And almost everybody would raise their hand. But then when we would watch them back, we would hear things like, Kelly, if you're interested, let me know. Or if you'd like to learn more, here's the website. And that is not a direct ask. So it's remembering to make sure that you don't do this passive asking, which so many of us are naturally inclined to do. Now, it's better than nothing, but when you force a choice to someone like, would you like this? Or may I have a raise? Obviously you're going to make your case. You're not just going to flat out and say, may I have a raise? But you're going to make your case so that by the end of that conversation, you make that direct ask. So those are some tips that I would offer right away on that.
That's great because and I feel like I just had my hand slapped a little bit because I did a video in my Facebook group and I realized I didn't make a direct ask. I did that, let me know, book a call, maybe, I think. I don't even remember exactly, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't a direct ask. So now I've been told and I need to fix it.
I love your vulnerability. We all do it. I was laughing because I was looking at an email that I sent last year after a workshop that I just did this year. So I wanted to use the same template. And I was quite impressed with my moxie because the second bullet point, I had, here are some ideas for next steps. And it almost took me aback when I read it, even this year. And it said, hire me. Here's I thought, wow, that was kind of brazen, but it was direct.
I love that because I think there's too much out there that, as you say, is passive.
Mhm.
And as we said, if you don't ask for what you want, nobody's reading your mind. And
Exactly.
how do you make it easy for people to respond? Yes, you ask a very direct, simple question.
Mhm.
Not yes, but, or let me think about it, or well, yeah, that sounds good, and I'll come back to it. Right? Just
Mhm.
yes.
You're really, even just in this conversation, you're making me think about how often we'll say yes to things and then go, oh wait, like some justification afterward. And I love what you just said of, okay, yes. And it's actually the same with the no when you think about boundaries, how so often we want to explain ourselves of no, da 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 da, here's the reason, here's all the 10 reasons why I can't volunteer for this or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Each
Yeah.
one of those is a complete sentence in and of itself. It doesn't need more. And yet, I know I continually try to justify whatever the decision is, or
Mhm.
leave
Yeah.
myself an out, maybe, or
Yeah. I mean, I do it too. I'm working on these things all the time. I always tell people I'm a work in progress.
definitely. I don't have it all figured out. None of us has it all figured out. Um,
Right.
what would you say counts most when it comes to communicating? What you say or how you say it?
Ooh, I've got to start with a study because it is really important to give the credit to this researcher because it continues to get replicated. So, in this study by Albert Morabian, who wrote a book called Silent Messages, he set out to figure out what does matter most related to your credibility in anytime you're communicating. And at that time, it was in person. Now, there's 3 V's that he came up with, which is basically what's always happening in a communication experience. One is the words you're saying, so the verbal, he called it the verbal, and then how you're saying it is through the visual, what people see of you, And then there's also the vocal, how you sound. So I always like to ask people to think of those three elements. If they equal 100%, which do you think carries the most weight? The visual, the vocal, or the verbal, being the words? So do you want to guess, Kelly? Maybe you already know.
Well, it's interesting because as you were saying, I was thinking about our world today and how much is yes visual, but like my audio podcast, if people are listening to us, they're not getting the visual at
Right.
all. And so it's
Exactly.
only the words and the tone. And it made me think of when I first started the podcast, which is almost 6 years ago. It'll be 6 years ago in
Oh,
February. And my first couple of episodes, I was in a mastermind group and a couple of people responded and said, I can tell you're reading. And it reminded me that yeah, I was scripting out. They were all mostly solo episodes, and I was scripting it out to organize my own thoughts. And I was reading it, and I was like, "Oh, I need to be excited about this. I need to have more inflection, and I need to really embody it." So I'm going to go with the vocal.
okay. So given that this was when the visual is present, and we'll speak to the vocal only,
Okay.
and I'm so glad you brought that up because that's very important to acknowledge. So in the study, what carried 55% is visual. The vocal was 38%, and the words or the message itself was only 7%.
Wow.
Now, what's important to recognize, it doesn't mean that only 7% of what we say matters, but these numbers relate to an inconsistent message. So if I tell you, kind of like your example, if I say, I'm so excited to be here, it's really going to be great, and I say it in this monotone voice, you're not going, like, it's going to be a mismatch. You go, that doesn't work. Or when I do this in person, I actually do an exercise where I have everybody make the peace sign and they put it, oops, there's my balloons. For those of you watching, you see my balloons. So you put it above your head, to the side, in front of you, above, and I have people kind of doing Simon Says, so they're copying me, and then I say, put it on your chin. But for those of you that are only listening to this right now, I've got my hand on my cheek, but it's confusing because I'm saying chin, and then people are like, which is it?
Mm.
So that's one just a very poignant example. But most of the time, when we think about real life scenarios, if somebody doesn't sound excited and they don't look excited, but they're saying they're excited, then people are only going to remember 7% of what they said on average.
Mm.
So if we then translate this to audio only, so I'm not a good math person here, so I'm trying to write these numbers down myself, but it's something like 82% is the audio, the voice itself, and then 16% is content. That's not math, good math though. 82, 92. Well, what's,
Eight,
anyway,
18, 82,
100 minus 82.
18.
Thank you, 18. So then 18% is all that people will retain if the audio is poor or doesn't match with what the words are saying. So
Mm.
it's really interesting when you take that visual away. So if we think, yeah,
I was just gonna say, it's fascinating, and it reminds me of, I believe it's a Maya Angelou quote that is, I'm gonna butcher it because I don't have it in front of me, but people don't remember what we said so much as how we made them feel. It's
yes.
not the words in the quote, but that's the
So,
gist of it,
yep,
my
that's
paraphrase. And it's so true, and that's why our stories are so important, because they can connect people.
exactly.
Anybody listening can connect with the emotion. We have
Mhm.
to know what that emotion is, and we have to express it properly and clearly, but that's what people remember. That's what they walk away with.
Yes, totally. And that is such a great reminder of that. Because, and so if we think about, okay, well, what's the takeaway for people? Like, what do you actually do with this information? Well, from a content perspective, you make sure that you state your point up front so you don't have people wondering what all the detail is if they don't know why they're listening. And then remembering to have a lightness to your expression, especially when you're saying something that's positive, to be able to have that strength in your voice, to really have enough volume, have some changing up in your variety, like basically changing up your volume, your pitch, your pace to make it interesting. And I used to manage a call center years ago at the Gap in their corporate office. And when we would put mirrors in front of everybody to help them to see, because you can tell when if people are smiling over the phone.
Oh,
So
yeah.
that's another good reminder about how people experience you, even without the visual.
Definitely. When I recorded my book back here as an audiobook last year in January, it was something that I was really aware of. And I mean, obviously, I was very aware and familiar with the content, so it helped. But it was, people say it's like I'm just having a conversation with them when they listen to it, which is totally my goal with the
Oh,
podcast and with that. So
that's
it was
beautiful.
a good reminder that I'm not just reading.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I know. It is so hard to read something and sound natural.
Yeah.
That's also why I don't advocate for scripts, especially because I do so much with my clients around presenting and making sure that you have notes, but you don't read them like a script.
Exactly. Okay, so that's a great segue into me asking, how can people work with you, and what kind of results can you do you produce for them?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have something called the confidence cocktail. That is my signature framework. And what I have found is that, first of all, it's looking at, okay, what is it of the 6 ingredients that I have found that really help people to have that confidence, which really ends up being, in the end, what people want. And my promise or the results is that they will get more credibility, they will have more connection with their audiences and themselves, and they will also have more clarity. And the idea of the cocktail is that you might need a dash of, let's say, presence and a shot of brand identity, for example. And maybe the others you don't need as much. But the idea is to create the customized and perfect cocktail for you. But as far as very tangible way, most of the work that I do with people is recording them. And I know most people don't love, like, yeah, sign me up. I want to be recorded and
Right?
then play it back. But I always tell people, whether you work with me, another coach, or just do it yourself, record yourself and listen back, because that is the only way that you can truly objectively see and hear how you come across. So I have an actual membership where we walk through the cocktail. I have my clients rate themselves, and then ultimately in the end, they make more money. So if we go back to results, making more money, advancing in their careers, having more influence, being able to have the confidence to speak up perhaps when they weren't before. Or like somebody said last week, what if my problem isn't confidence? I speak too much. So I said, oh, I have a plan for that as well. And that is really making sure that you have strategies, because I always like to say it's about, I will provide the strategies, but you need to take the action for this to work. It's got to be a two-way street for sure, or a collaborative approach, I should say. And I have a membership, and that's how I work with people directly with one-on-one coaching as well as group. So it's called the Confident Communicators Club, and it is executives coaching plus group masterminding. And I found the group and the individual experience to be just amazing for the collective wisdom related to the group, but then also the individual to help really see, how do I come across and what do I want to shift, and getting sentence prompts to be able to know the best way to approach difficult conversations, or just simply, how do I start in speaking up at a meeting?
Yeah. And I love that you do the both, like individual and group, because I find in my programs that the group sparks other ideas. And so as people are sharing, because I help people find their stories and all kinds of
Oh,
stories, as people are sharing some of their answers to some of the prompts and exercises we do, other people go, oh, I didn't think of that. I can add this and this. And it just really helps people open up to the possibility. But then there is that piece where it can be more personalized. So that's awesome.
yes.
So how
Yeah.
can people find you to work with you?
My website, KarenLaos.com, and it's KarenLaos.com. I do also hang out on Instagram a lot, and I do a lot of short videos with tips. So that is at Karen Laos Official. And I have a podcast as well as a website, or I'm not a website. I have a podcast as well as a book.
Okay, all the ways. And we will make sure in our social media posts and everything to share those with the audience in case they haven't written it down as we've talked about it.
Sounds good.
Make it easy. Okay,
Okay.
one more fun question to wrap things up. If
Okay.
there were a book or a movie made of your life, what would the title be?
Say yes to the adventure.
Ooh, I like that. It
Thanks.
opens up so many possibilities.
Yeah, I would say that's funny. I was not expecting that. So that was totally impromptu, but I would say that that's really it. It's all about saying yes, even though I know that there are important times to say no and set boundaries. But I really see that as the essence of my life has always been what's possible. And one of my favorite quotes by, I believe it is Henry David Thoreau, but who knows where it originated for sure, is every wall is a door.
Mm.
And I've loved that quote since I was a kid, when I first heard it, teenager, I think. And I was always fascinated by that quote. And it's come to hold greater meaning for me as I've gotten older. Because a lot of times, for example, we think a no has to be a no. Sometimes a no is simply an invitation to a question to say, hey, what concerns do you have? And sometimes that can open up a whole new possibility. Because I have time to share a quick
Yeah,
example of
go
that?
for it.
Well,
Yeah.
it just occurred to me, this is one that has certainly got a lot of good feedback, but I will say, rejected as a TEDx speaker earlier this year. But I had gotten a call back for an interview, so I made the first cut. Well, I got the dreaded email saying I didn't make it, but I had such a great connection with the person. And it just so happened that I was going to be in Minneapolis that week, which is where the TEDx event was. And I asked the woman that interviewed me if she wanted to have coffee while I was in town, and she said yes. And that coffee led to her saying, well, you know what? I think you would be a great speaker coach on our team, but I can't make that decision. So I'll introduce you to the head speaker coach. Well, I ended up becoming a speaker coach for the team. And then, as a result of being on the team, I was nominated to be the MC for the event. So that was an example of turning a no into an even better yes, because the truth is, now that I know the whole process, I don't know that I want to be a TEDx speaker. So I feel like the MC was a great divine appointment that came unexpectedly, but it wasn't, I could have just said, oh, thanks, and then just called it a day. But I do think that it's important to remember, if you feel the urge, the inkling, the gut reaction, the hunch, whatever you want to call it, go for it, because you never know what can happen.
Yeah, I love that. And what keeps coming to mind for me is a little bit of a mix match of what you were saying. Say yes to the adventure and be open to the possibility. Say yes to the possible because we don't know.
Oh,
I'm going to write that down.
yeah. Write that down.
Thank you so much, Karen, for being here. I mean, we could talk forever. I know we could because you're sparking so much in me. So maybe you'll come back.
Oh,
Let's hope.
yeah, that would be awesome. Well, thank you for having me.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise.